Terrorism has triggered world wars before. 111 years ago, this year, 28 June 2025, marks the 111th anniversary of the assassination that sparked the First World War. And here we almost had a world war breakout in the last couple of weeks as Israel attacked Iran, and the Air Force went in at night and attacked these nuclear facilities inside Tehran, but they didn't have the means to get down to these massive underground facilities, and so they picked a war that they could not win, forcing America to come in to help them out of the mess that they got started in. And here's a picture from Tehran showing an oil refinery on the outskirts of the capital city aflame. And of course, with missiles raining down on Israel and on Tehran from both sides. And Iran, by the way, has got the largest collection of ballistic missiles in the region, maybe in the world. They've got phenomenal amount of missiles of all sorts of shapes, sizes, ranges, and capacities. And they were causing such havoc with the missiles raining down on Israel. Tel Aviv suffered something in the region of $1 trillion worth of damage to infrastructure and buildings. Whole buildings being destroyed. The Iron Dome could not cope. The missile intercepts couldn't cope for several reasons. One was the swarming of missiles coming through beyond their capacity. There's a limit to how much a defensive structure can handle at once, and some's always going to get through. But in addition to that, quite a lot of Iran's missiles are hypersonic. Iran's a very advanced people, and they've got such technology that they are selling drones and weapon systems to Russia, because Iran is very advanced in these things. And the industrialization was done back in the days of the Shah of Iran, and Iran, or old Persia, is, of course, once a great civilization. Here you can see a hospital complex in Israel that was hit by Tehran missiles. And this is also Tel Aviv, showing some of the destruction coming in. You can't imagine how much destruction some of these ballistic missiles have done. When they say $1 trillion worth of damage, one estimate I saw was that 1/3 of Tel Aviv is in ruins. So this was causing such havoc on a daily basis. Somebody had to do something to stop it. I mean, imagine these used to be people's homes, and just devastation. I don't know if you can notice here how some of the clothing or fabric and curtains have been blown out of this back window. You can see the piles here on the ground from the explosion inside. So any kind of fabric that could be blown out the window was being blown out. Now, Iran has some nuclear sites. Now, to be fair, they've got nuclear research centers, they've got nuclear sites and heavy water research reactors. But then Cape Town has a nuclear power plant at Kuburg. That doesn't mean that we have a nuclear bomb. Nuclear power plants are an acceptable way of getting clean energy. And we've got, I think in Cape Town, the only nuclear power station in sub-Saharan Africa. So just the presence of a nuclear site does not mean it's a nuclear bomb producing site. And to also be fair, Iran has been allowing inspections from the International Nuclear Energy Commission to do on-site inspections for years. They stopped their nuclear bomb program in 2003, and according to the head of the American intelligence community, Iran had no policy of seeking a nuclear weapon, had abandoned it, and had no nuclear bomb, nor was close to being able to produce one. And while that was repudiated by the American president, we don't have evidence that Israel had a nuclear bomb or was about to get one. Nevertheless, with the nuclear research centers in ruins, they won't be able to get one in a hurry either. Now, the United States put a lot of weaponry in the area. They moved entire carrier strike groups. They moved 3 battle fleets into the Indian Ocean, and we expected any attack on Iran to be launched from these aircraft carriers or even from Diego Garcia. But instead, America chose to showcase their B-2 stealth bombers. And they launched 7 of them from America, which flew phenomenal distance, needing in-flight refueling by air tankers en route. And interesting, this looks just like the German Horten jet bomber that was designed during the Second World War. It's the same wing shape and dimensions. So these planes needed in-flight refueling, which is a tremendous logistical achievement anyway, to be able to do this. And they showed they didn't even need to pre-position these B-2s at Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean. They didn't need to use the aircraft carriers. From the United States, they could fly there non-stop, bomb Iran and fly back, which might have been just testing the technical capability of doing it, or showing the world we can do this without even having assets on the ground. But these 7 B-2 stealth bombers came in, apparently were not able to be detected, bombed these 2 targets, and then a 3rd target was hit by swarms of Tomahawk missiles launched by a single submarine in the Indian Ocean, interestingly. This is a picture from Tehran, from someone in Tehran, showing a massive explosion just beyond the horizon, visible from Tehran. That must have been Operation Midnight Hammer. Well, we were so close to a war in the Middle East, but incredibly, we seem to have come back from the brink, and I'm so glad for that, because that could have gotten out of hand very, very quickly. The other nuclear powers in the region, like Pakistan, this could have really gone bad. So Israel bombed Iran. Iran rocketed Israel. Israel continued to bomb Iran. Iran continued to bomb Israel. Then America sent their B-2s in and took out the nuclear facilities within Iran. Iran then bombed the American base in Qatar, but they gave them warning: we're going to bomb your facility at a certain time. In came the rocket. The Americans evacuated the base. No one was hurt, no one was injured. And then America negotiated a peace deal off that. The idea being, we've hit you, you've hit us, let's call it quits. And that's surprising, but it seems to have worked. And some of the estimation is Israel and Iran were probably looking for a way to get out. They were both getting devastated. Every day, their economies were being degraded, their homes were being destroyed, their capital cities were being devastated. So every day this went on, they were getting poorer, weaker, and depleting their reserves of weapons as well. So America took away the reason for the arguments, which is these nuclear research sites and heavy water development plants, and then allowed Iran to hit one of their bases and didn't react. And at this point, they've got a ceasefire, which is quite extraordinary, because this could have developed into a regional war, even into a world war. But let's continue to pray that this peace holds. So on the 28th of June, 1914, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie, were assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia, a name that pops up with monotonous regularity in history. Considering the catastrophic consequences, it's remarkable how little is generally known about that fateful day and what led up to it. Security personnel and bodyguards can learn no end of lessons from what not to do from this catalogue of security failures on that day, that very fateful day, in that very volatile and violent city. First of all, the scheduled visit of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand to Bosnia was published as early as March. Sarajevo was a volatile, cosmopolitan, half-Oriental community of 42,000 people back in 1914. For hundreds of years, Sarajevo had been under Ottoman Turkish Muslim rule. The Austrians had liberated Bosnia and Herzegovina from the Ottoman Turkish Empire in 1878, which wasn't that long ago from that perspective. In 1908, the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina were incorporated formally into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a polyglot nation. There's many different races, groups, language groups in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The date chosen for the state visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand to Sarajevo was a date of painful historic significance for the Serbs. It was the anniversary of the disastrous defeat on the 28th of June, 1389, at the hands of the Ottoman Turks at Kosovo. Now, those who forget the lessons of history, are doomed to repeat them. Despite Austria playing a leading role in liberating the Balkans, major role, rescuing them from the Turkish oppression, and from centuries of Ottoman Turkish oppression. Ottoman Empire, remember, was a massive force, a massive empire, which had at one time even threatened the gates of Vienna. The neighboring country of Serbia wasn't grateful for Austria having liberated their areas from the Turks. They were intensely hostile to Austria. Serbia wanted to greatly expand its territory to include all the Slavs of the Balkans, which was something that was ultimately given to them at the Versailles Treaty. And the Yugoslav Republic was a tremendously oppressive communist state that caused no end of grief for its inhabitants. But Serbia had this obsession of a kingdom of the South Slavs. And they wanted Bosnia and Herzegovina to also be incorporated into Serbia, which had only recently been liberated from the Turks through the First Balkan War. Now, Serbia was a monarchy, and they tasted victory against the Turks in the Balkan War of 1912. And they deluded themselves that they were a great power, able to even take on the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you should never underestimate your enemies. The head of Serbian military intelligence, Colonel Dragutin Dimitrovic, known by his codename Apis, named after the Egyptian bull god. Remember, the Israelites, after coming out of Egypt, built the golden calf? Well, that's Apis, that's the Egyptian bull god. This Dragutin, Colonel Dragutin, also controlled the Black Hand, an international terrorist group run by Major Voljan Tankosevic. And it was this group who provided the young Bosnians, including Gavrilo Princip, with 4 Browning semi-automatic pistols, 6 bombs, and the same number of cyanide capsules. This was in May 1914. Princip received some training in pistol target practice in a park in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. You know, we would find it a little strange if you're sort of downtown and you're in the gardens and there's some people doing pistol practice, but apparently that wasn't too unusual back in 1914. Colonel Dragutin Dimitrovic was described as a revolutionary fanatic, pale, bald, heavy, enigmatic, like a giant Mongolian. Dragutin never married. He was devoted to the movement of Serb nationalism. He is married to international terrorism. He required his revolutionaries to undergo a hooded initiation rite, a ritual which included a seal engraved with a skull and crossbones, not well drawn from what I can see, a dagger, a bomb, and a poison. This is all part of their symbolism. Sort of think like the skull and bones initiation ceremony in Yale University. Murder had been his business since his involvement in the 1903 assassination of King Alexander and Queen Draga of Serbia. So King Alexander and his wife, Queen Draga, were the targets of the revolutionaries, and the king and queen were murdered in their own palace bedroom by a group of Serbian army officers, which included Dragutin. I'm sure you would have thought you could trust your officer corps, but apparently not. And they were brutal and savage with how they treated the corpses of the king and queen, even displaying them on a table, absolutely disgraceful behavior, and then posing for selfie pics in the bedroom of the murdered royals. Now, hardly a democracy, Serbia was described by many as a rogue state. Their rulers were intimately involved in international terrorism. And the evidence is overwhelming. The young Serbian terrorists who murdered the Archduke Franz Ferdinand received their weapons from their Serbian military and received their basic training in the capital of Serbia in Belgrade Park. The Serbian Prime Minister, Pasic, informed the cabinet at the end of May assassins were on their way to Sarajevo and they were going to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Serbian state documents, which Austria later captured when they invaded Belgrade, they saw it included details about the movements of the assassins, the kind of bombs and pistols in their luggage, their route. The Ministry of Interior in Belgrade was fully briefed on all aspects of the mission. But no warning was ever forwarded to the Austrian authorities of this planned assassination, which is in breach of international law and very bad manners. From the Austrian side, the lack of rudimentary security arrangements on that tragic day is astounding. Acts of terrorism in and from the Balkans were a clear and present danger. British newspapers published cartoons of Serbian anarchists asking each other, "What time is it by your bomb?" And as Archduke Franz Ferdinand left his estate on the 23rd of June, 1914, to travel by train to Bosnia, he commented, "Our journey starts. Down there, they will throw bombs at us." Doubtless he meant it as a joke, but it wasn't a joke. That's exactly what happened. The Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Joseph, had lost his wife, the Empress Elizabeth, to assassination. And the Empress Elizabeth was a much beloved character. She came from Bavaria. She was obsessed with having a thin waist, and I think she maintained her waist at 14 inches to the end of her life, which is extraordinary. And she did daily gymnastics. She was obsessed with physical fitness, including horse riding, all kinds of things that she did to maintain her extremely slim figure. And she was a very accomplished horse rider. So Empress Elizabeth was known to care for the poor. She did a lot of charity work and much beloved by the people. And she was targeted by these communist assassins. So in Geneva, she was about to board a steamer on Lake Geneva when an anarchist assassin came up and stabbed her in the heart with a stiletto. Now, interestingly, she was wearing such a tight corset that she didn't start to bleed immediately, and she is able to board the steamer despite having received a fatal injury before collapsing. And they said it was because of the extremely tight corset that she was able to still be walking even after having been fatally stabbed. And this created grief throughout the world. She was much beloved in Austria, but respected worldwide. And the assassin said, "I'm an anarchist by conviction. I came to Geneva to kill a sovereign, with the object of giving an example. It did not matter to me who the sovereign was whom I should kill." And the ice pick he used, nasty, horrible piece of work, this character. Well, all over the world there was grief, and there's a beautiful memorial to Queen Elizabeth or the Empress Elizabeth, I should say, in the Vienna Gardens. In 1908, a 20-year-old Slav student assassinated Count Potocki, the governor of Galicia. And at the trial of an American-born Croat who had fired at a member of the royal family, the judge asked, "Do you think killing people is justified?" And the man responded, "In this case, it is. It is a general opinion in America, and behind me are 500,000 American Croats." Now, bear in mind, America deluded themselves that they were the result of revolution. And these days we speak about the American War of Independence, but at that stage, I still spoke about the American Revolution, and the Americans were basically orientated to being sympathetic to revolution. They thought revolution is good, although, of course, the French Revolution was extremely, extremely bad, and every revolution like it since has left everyone worse off than they were before. So insane that anyone could have had a positive view of revolution, but then even the French Revolution was being glamorized by some. Even when I went to school, the French Revolution was put forward as something that was good, that brought about democracy and so on, which is totally insane. The French Revolution was anti-Christian and it was anti-freedom. In 1906, an anarchist bombed the wedding procession of King Alfonso XIII of Spain. He was marrying a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and they could have gotten wiped out in that bombing. But the bombing killed a lot of people in the crowd, but it didn't actually affect the royal family. And in June 1908, a young Bosnian, Bogdan Sarajevo, failed in his attempt to assassinate the emperor himself in Mostar. And later, the same terrorist traveled to Sarajevo and fired at General Marijan Varisanin. And it was alleged the Black Hand of Serbia had provided his revolver that he's using in these assassinations and attempted assassinations. June 1912, the governor of Croatia was fired upon in Zagreb, which is in Croatia. Although the governor was missed, a member of his administration was wounded. In March 1914, the Vicar General of Transylvania was killed by a time bomb sent through the post from Romania. Numerous conspiracies to assassinate officials were detected and prevented by the Austrian police. This is a time of assassinations. Interestingly enough, Gavrilo Princip was known by the Austrian police to be a potential threat. They had a file on him, potential threat, stamped in red. Yet, when General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, was warned of the threat from the young Bosnians, he only laughed. The officials at Sarajevo spent more time and energy discussing dinner menus and the correct temperature at which to serve the wines than issues of security. And you would have thought that security was their first concern, but apparently not. So on June the 28th, 1914, a date of intense significance for the Serbians, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria, sets out in the uniform of a cavalry general, blue tunic, gold collar, 3 stars, silver stars on the collar, black trousers, red stripes. His wife Sophie wears a white hat with a veil, long white silk dress, red and white fabric roses tucked into red sash. On the morning of the 28th of June, in accordance with the published schedule, which these days you don't do when it comes to security for high-profile figures, the motorcade left Sarajevo railway station. And shortly before reaching its first scheduled stop, a bomb was thrown by Nedeljko Kabrinovic, and it struck the car of Franz Ferdinand, but was deflected. Some reports have that the Archduke caught it in his hand and threw the bomb behind his car. Others that he deflected with a move of his arm. But either way, the bomb didn't explode in the vehicle where it was aimed for, but immediately behind the vehicle, and wounded 2 bystanders. As Kabrinovic was arrested and led away, he shouted loudly, "I'm a Serbian hero." And other conspirators lost their nerve and failed to use their weapons. There were others standing around, but the others didn't support him with throwing their bombs. You know, you can't deflect multiple bombs at the same time. And none of them fired their pistols at that stage. By the way, he tried to swallow cyanide, but it didn't work. Despite the attack, the Archduke continued with his published schedule, meeting with the Governor General, where he watched 2 local girls perform a folklore dance. And he even went to the hospital to visit some of the people injured in the bombing. Those wounded by the bombs were being treated. He visited them to encourage them. And upon leaving the town hall, the driver took a wrong turn. It's amazing how many assassinations happen, or crimes, because the driver got lost or took a wrong turn. And this is probably one of the most fateful wrong turns. He turned left after crossing the bridge. Yes, he should have stuck right. So the published route, and then they had the altered route, and near the Apple Quay is where the assassination took place. The driver was told stop and turn around, but cars in those days didn't have a reverse gear. So they could only put in neutral, and someone would have to get out the car and push the car backwards. That's the way you did a reverse in 1914. Push backwards into Apple Quay. And would you believe it, they stopped right next to where Gavrilo Princip was standing, dejected that he had missed his opportunity to assassinate the Archduke. And because of a wrong turn, he turned up right in front of him. It's like the devil laid this up. And right by this bridge, the assassination took place. Gavrilo Princip walked up to the open car, fired point-blank range at Franz and Sophie Ferdinand. He wasn't known to be a particularly good shot. He must have been one of the luckiest shots ever. He managed to hit both in a vital place with just 2 shots fired. And he hits 2 targets. Absolutely staggering. Now, good security would have had security people on the running boards of these cars or walking next to them. They weren't driving that fast anyway. But there were no security visible. And he gets both husband and wife with this Browning pistol, which is not a high caliber weapon. It's not a particularly well-made weapon either, but nevertheless, it did the job of this anarchist. And you can see the markings. This is a Serbian military issue Browning. The last words of the Archduke were, "Sophie, Sophie, do not die. Stay alive for our children." But sadly, Sophie perished that same day. And this is the uniform that the Archduke was wearing at the time. And you can see the remnants of the blood. Even the New York Herald was reporting on this assassination with shock. The St. Louis Globe, assassin kills heir to Austrian throne and wife on the streets of the Bosnian capital. Royal couple shot after they escaped death from bomb. So these days in security, if there's an attack on a principal, they cancel the rest of the schedule. You don't carry on because this assassin might be part of a team. They often do work in teams. And that if the first fails, there are others. So you don't continue with your published schedule after an assassination has failed. This is a classic example of how not to do security. Serb student assassinates Archduke and his Duchess. Bomb hurled into carriage, fails to explode, uses pistol. Not totally accurate. And another one of his people has hurled a bomb, and that did explode, but it was deflected to behind the attack. So again, reminding, you can't trust everything you get in the newspaper. Fires several shots, which is not true. He fired 2 shots, and both of them hit vital organs. So a newspaper report's not totally correct. They were survived by their daughter and 2 sons. 28th of June 1914 was Franz and Sophie Ferdinand's 14th wedding anniversary. The correlation of dates is just extraordinary. And by the way, occultists love dates, significant dates. They choose to do horrible things on significant dates and places. So who chose 28th of June for a state visit to Sarajevo? Did they not know Serb history? If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it again. The district judge, Louis Pfeffer, commented on Princip. It's difficult to imagine that so frail-looking an individual could have committed so serious a deed. And in fact, Princip had volunteered to fight for Serbia during the First Balkan War of 1912, and he was rejected as being too small. And at his first interrogation with the police in Sarajevo, Princip declared throughout his life, wherever he went, people took him for a weakling, and he wanted to prove them wrong by committing such a heinous atrocity. And you wonder how many of these frail characters are being manipulated. Just take that character who shot at Donald Trump, what was the year ago, in Butler, Pennsylvania. He looked like some kind of transvestite, some frail-looking dweeb, and he doubtless got manipulated by people into doing this act, which I'm sure was meant to succeed. And you wonder how many people who've got some kind of complex are fed mind-altering drugs and manipulated by psychologists and so on into committing some horrible deeds, which then you can say was done by some lone nut. No conspiracy here, and that happens all the time. Within days, all the conspirators were in custody, except the Muslim, Mohammed, escaped to Montenegro, but the rest were all captured. And Austria did not execute adolescents, no matter how heinous their crimes. And Princip was either 17 or 18 years old, they weren't sure. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died of natural causes, tuberculosis, April 1918. Not before a few million had died in the war he started, though. Before he died, he was asked by the prison psychiatrist, do you have any regrets that your deeds sparked a world war and the deaths of millions? Princip made clear he had no regrets. And what kind of person was this that could not feel awful about having shot not just the heir to the throne, but his beloved wife, who, honestly, what had she done wrong? And interestingly, Princip had killed the one man in the Austrian Empire who was committed to averting war with either Serbia or Russia. He was probably the best friend the Slavs had. Franz Ferdinand had been the one member of the Austrian royal family who had good relations with the Russians. And Franz Ferdinand was on record declaring, I shall never lead a war against Russia. I will make sacrifice to avoid it. A war between Austria and Russia would either end with the overthrow of the Romanovs or the overthrow of the Habsburgs, or perhaps the overthrow of both, which is in fact what happened. He once wrote to the foreign minister, let us not play Balkan warriors ourselves. Let us not stoop to this hooliganism. Let us stay aloof and watch the scum bush in one another's skulls. It would be unforgivable, insane, to start something that would pit us against Russia. Franz Ferdinand's moderate stance seen in how, despite all the threats, he chose to make a state visit to one of the most volatile cities. in one of the most unstable parts of Europe, in an open car, with almost no security. So you could see where he stood. He was a serious moderate. But it is the practice of terrorists to assassinate moderates, to provoke reaction. Remember, Louis XVI, who got beheaded in the French Revolution, he wasn't the most harsh ruler France had ever had. He was probably the most moderate. He's the one who signed the Edict of Toleration. He's the one who brought back the parliamentary democracy, which they hadn't had the parliament meet in France for about 126 years. And so he's the one who was the moderate. He was the reformer. And those are the ones they target. The British ambassador in Germany declared the assassination was a dreadful act, of which the political consequences are incalculable. And in St. Petersburg, Russia, the journalists dismissed this assassination as a characteristic bit of Balkan savagery. Almost every country in Europe had suffered the effects of assassinations by these communist revolutionaries, who at that time were called anarchists, like Princip, and there was general sympathy for Austria and general disgust for Serbia's obvious role in the assassination, which makes it more remarkable that despite this horrible atrocity taking place, and in just a month later, most of Europe mobilized against Austria's attempts to deal with the Serbian terrorist threat. And here's the bizarre thing. Austria had a legitimate gripe with the terrorists sponsoring Serbia. So what are France and Britain and Russia fighting in this for? And Admiral Tirpitz of Germany said this war really is the greatest lunacy ever committed by the white races. Some people call it the auto-genocide of Europe, or the Great Civil War of the West. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who often got blamed for the war, said, "It's not I who bears responsibility for this disaster, which now threatens the entire civilized world." In fact, although when the Austrian Archduke was murdered by the Serb terrorists on the 28th of June, the Kaiser had given the Austrians support to act against Serbia. By the last days of July, no monarch in Europe was doing more to desperately try to stop Europe's plunge into war. And to blame Kaiser Wilhelm, when he was the one monarch trying to stop the war, is not fair. And by the way, the Americans were totally sympathetic to Serbia, and to show how much they supported Serbia, every 28th of June, throughout the First World War, the Serbian flag was hoisted at the White House, because General Woodrow Wilson thought that this assassination was a good thing. I mean, can you imagine how disgusting that is? Imagine raising Hamas's flag on the anniversary of the 7th of October 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel. I mean, how would that go down? But America deliberately not only flew the flag of Serbia on the anniversary of this assassination at the White House, but you'll see they manipulated events so that the Versailles Treaty was signed on the same date, the 28th of June, 1919. Proverbs 26, verse 17 says, "He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a dog by its ears." If you grab a dog by its ears, what do you think is going to happen to your face? 1914 shattered Europe. An entire generation of young men died in brutal trench warfare. And by the way, something like 80% of all the casualties in the First World War were artillery. And that's one reason why when I've gone to battle sites like in Ypres in Belgium, I couldn't find many graves of Hammonds, but I saw many Hammonds' names written on the walls. If they couldn't find a body because it's been blown to pieces, literally, they would put the names on the walls of the soldiers who had died. So I counted 65 Hammonds on the walls just in Ypres. And I didn't go to every cemetery, it just went to 6 of the biggest. There's 140 odd British and Commonwealth war graves, cemeteries, just within 10 kilometers of Ypres. And at one point, I went to the British Commonwealth War Graves Commission and asked them how many Hammonds died in the First World War. They looked it up, 480, just of my family name, perished in the First World War. I walked over towards Langemark, where they've got the German war graves, and I counted 7 Lindemanns, my mother's family name, on their walls. No other war changed the map of Europe so dramatically. But it didn't just change the map of Europe, it changed Europe itself. So before the First World War, 64% of Europeans were in church every Sunday on average. At the end of the First World War, it was down to 40% of Europe was in church every Sunday. At the end of the Second World War, it was 4% of Europe was in church every Sunday. From 64% to 40% to 4%. The world wars devastated the spiritual life of Europe. 3 great European empires were destroyed. The great German Empire, which is the sense of culture. You think how much has come from Germany, like the Protestant Reformation, the printing press, some of the greatest musicians on earth. Think of Bach and Handel and Beethoven, and think of Neuschwanstein Castle, just the architecture, the magnificence of the culture in Germany from which so much of our culture has been influenced. And this was destroyed by the First World War. On the belt buckles of German soldiers was Gott mit uns, God with us, which is Gustavus Adolphus's motto, the Swedish king in the 30 Years' War. The Russian Empire was destroyed, and Russia was a great Orthodox Christian country, which had civilized and evangelized the whole of North Asia, all the way through to the Pacific Ocean. The great Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had held the line and protected Europe from endless attacks from the Turks for centuries. Even Vienna had been besieged twice and had withstood the Turkish assaults. And they had kept Europe from becoming Eurabia for centuries. 1914 marked the end of the greatest century of Christian advance. Great century of missions, as I call it. And the beginning of what proved to be the worst century of persecution. More Christians were killed for their faith in the 20th century than all other centuries combined. So in just the 20th century, more Christians perished, over 42 million, more than all the Christians who were martyred between the 19th century and the first century. The consequence of the First World War continues to have far-reaching repercussions to the present day. Just think how it changed warfare. Before the First World War, the cavalry were the ultimate arm of any military force. And during the First World War, you start to see cavalry officers wearing gas masks. I mean, how bizarre is that? And you had cavalry, and the new cavalry being the aircraft above. And trench warfare, barbed wire, machine guns, aircraft, gas, all kinds of hideous things, submarines. Never seen these kind of weapons before in warfare. Now, can you imagine civilization just drowning in mud, literally? At the Battle of Passchendaele, the Canadians marched whole divisions into the mud, and they just disappeared. Horses, artillery, carriages, entire units disappeared in the mud because the water table's low, and the British had pumped 5 tons of high explosives on every square meter of the battlefield. And when they ordered their men in, the men just drowned in the mud, literally. And then many of them were killed in friendly fire, artillery fire from their own sides. And at one point, the general was ordered to consolidate, and he said, "You cannot consolidate porridge." They're literally fighting in the mud and disappearing up to their eyeballs, literally, in mud. This is the biggest man-made crater outside of the Great Hole in Kimberley, caused by one big explosion. They brought in Welsh miners who dug and dug and dug under the German trenches to create a colossal explosion that could be heard all the way back in England. And the end result was water just poured in, and they didn't just kill a lot of people, they created inland lakes where there'd never been any before. And this was just from explosives. So in that sense, even more incredible achievement than Kimberley, although that was done one spadeful at a time. So in the First World War, Germany mobilized 11 million men in arms. France mobilized 8.4 million. Britain mobilized 8.9 million, 250,000 of which were underage boys. And one boy was discovered to be 12. Now, I've been at the grave of a 14-year-old boy in Ypres. and it's a grave visited more by anyone else. The British just turned a blind eye to the amount of underage boys volunteering for the army. Today, they criticize African nations that have child soldiers. Well, all of Europe had child soldiers in the Second World War II, in the First World War too, and Britain a full 250,000. They might have had the biggest amount of child soldiers in the battle. Of course, it wasn't just the British fighting. They pulled up their colonials, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Indians, and average life expectancy in the trenches for the British was about 6 weeks. Italy, by the way, mobilized 5.6 million soldiers, Austria 7.8 million, United States mobilized 4.3 million. Of the 60 million European soldiers who were mobilized from 1914 to 1918, over 9 million were killed, 1 in 6. Another 9 million were permanently disabled, crippled. Another 15 million were seriously injured. That means more than half of all the soldiers mobilized were casualties of one sort or another, in varying degrees of seriousness, from death to injury. Contemporaries called it the Great War, because it was literally greater than any war ever waged before that time. They didn't call it the First World War at the time. They didn't know there'd be a sequel. In terms of soldiers involved, numbers of casualties, in terms of catastrophic consequences, the First World War was the most catastrophic event in the history of European civilization. Absolutely catastrophic in the damage. Proverbs 3 verse 30 tells us, do not strive with a man without cause, if he has done you no harm. Why did so many soldiers, including my own relatives, end up fighting against people who were fellow Christians in many cases? And then you've got Versailles. The Versailles Treaty, which was signed on the 28th of June, 1919, has to be recognized as the worst failure of a peace treaty ever signed in history. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to guarantee peace. One of my books on my shelf on the Versailles Treaty is called Peacemakers. Well, I think they were anything but peacemakers. It led to the most violent, destructive century in the history of mankind. The Treaty of Versailles, which is meant to have ended the First World War, guaranteed the Second World War and led to the destruction of Western Christian civilization in much of Europe and changed the world for over a century. You cannot understand the history of the Soviet Union or the history of Eastern Europe without understanding the pivotal role played by the destructive Versailles Treaty, which was required to be signed on the 28th of June to particularly celebrate the fact that Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were killed on that date. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. What a man sows, that shall he also reap. The US Secretary of State Lansing said of this peace treaty, which he and President Woodrow Wilson brought home, the Versailles Treaty menaces the existence of civilization. They called it at the time the war to end all wars. But I think you've noticed there's been a lot of wars since 1914, since 1919. Injustice, arrogance displayed in the hour of triumph will never be forgotten or forgiven, said the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and he should know he was part of it. Lord Alfred Balfour declared, these three all-powerful, all-ignorant men, referring to the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, and the President of America, these three all-powerful, all-ignorant men, sitting there carving continents with only a child to lead them. Timed to coincide with the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian terrorists, 28th June 1914, which is credited as being the spark that led to the catastrophic First World War. Why would you want to celebrate that with that date and with the Serbian flag at the White House? 2 Chronicles 19 verse 2 says, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. If you wonder why so much has gone wrong in the 20th century, just look at its roots, and you can see why God might be displeased with many of the countries who had a part in this. 2 Peter 2 verse 19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. And there's so much money being made by wars, by the so-called military-industrial complex, and a bunch of others out there. So you just think of these soldiers marched off to war, and they all were told, you're fighting for your country, you're fighting for peace, you're fighting for justice, you're fighting for freedom. And they went out and they didn't know they were being abused by the politicians to destroy the very Christian civilization they thought they were fighting to defend. By the way, before the war, you can see here the amount of men under arms in the columns. So Britain had 338,000, Germany had 834,000, France had 794,000, Russia had 1.3 million men under arms. Britain, you can see in the number in the circle says how much money they were spending on armaments in dollars, in millions of dollars. So Britain was spending more millions in armaments than either France or Germany, but it's because the Royal Navy took a lot more expense because, battleships and so on are very expensive equipment. But you can see Britain is spending more than Austria and Germany combined. And you can see France is spending as much as Germany, even though the population was a lot less. Russia is spending a lot. So when it comes to armaments and men under power, you can see that there's no overwhelming extremism on the German side who are being accused of being militarists, but they weren't the ones who controlled 1/5 of the world's land surface like the British, or about 1/3 of the world's land surface like France. And the British Empire controlled literally 1 out of 5 people in the world was under Britain. And then how can they accuse the Kaiser of being a warmonger when he hadn't caused 1 war, when Britain had just gone through 30 wars in the same time period that the Kaiser had not fought 1 war, and they controlled so much of the world's planet. Then they accused Germany of being militarists and Germany of wanting world domination, which that's what Britain and France already had. And after the war, Britain had an even bigger empire because they stole a whole lot of Germany's territories, which included every German farmer in Southwest Africa or Tanzania lost their farm, lost their property, lost their home, lost everything, furniture, whatever it was. Every asset overseas was lost. Literally, just taken. I mean, grand theft on a high order. And so the assassination of Sarajevo is called the spark in the tinderbox, and that's what it was. Micah 6:8 says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" That's a great verse. And by the way, you'd be amazed to know where I heard that verse once. I was up at University of Cape Town for a graduation service in 1978. Not that I studied there, but I was visiting someone else who was being graduated in Jamison Hall, and the chancellor stood up and said, "He has shown you, a man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" Then he expounded on mercy and justice and humility. I haven't heard such a good speech at a Bible college or Christian university graduation. I've been to a few. I've been to a graduation of Cornerstone Christian University in Cape Town, where they didn't quote from the Bible at all, where the chancellor, the guest speaker, everybody who spoke only quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. and from Mahatma Gandhi and from Voltaire, for goodness sakes, but not a quote from the Bible, not a quote from a single Christian, not a quote from a missionary, a reformer, nothing. And not even a decent hymn. And to think that a secular university could have a more God-honoring biblical message at a graduation service than a theological college and a Christian university. So don't let the labels fool you. Sometimes things are not quite as they appear. So if anyone wants to know my sources, A.J.P. Taylor, I was reading A.J.P. Taylor when I was a teenager already, one of the best historians on the First World War. And there's some very useful books on the First World War. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn's colossal classic, August 1914, which is the death knell of Christian civilization in Russia. Russia was mobilized in the guns of August 1914, where they lost millions of men in fruitless war, which made possible the Bolshevik Revolution. Very interesting, Richard Milton's book, The Best of Enemies, Britain and Germany. Truth and Lies in 2 World Wars. You know, Britain and Germany were the best of friends before 1914. They had never fought against one another before 1914. Britain and France were eternal enemies. Britain and Russia had been enemies, like in the Crimean War. Germany had always been British allies. In fact, the British royal family was totally German. If you've ever seen the film Young Victoria, where poor Prince Albert struggles to speak in English without a tough German accent with Queen Victoria. Absolute nonsense. They spoke in German the whole time. They brought up their children speaking German in Buckingham Palace. That was their first language on both sides. And the idea that Britain and Germany have been enemies forever is just not true. They were such good friends and allies. They're basically the same people. The Anglo-Saxons, the Saxon part is German. Where did the Reformation start? In Saxony, Wittenberg, Saxony. Martin Luther was a Saxon. The British are Anglo-Saxons. Where did the Angles come from? England. That's where the name England comes from. Well, Angles were from what today is known as Denmark. So the British and Germans are basically the same people. And for them to be talked into fighting one another and to hating one another, absolutely extraordinary. And so this is a very useful book to expose the fact that they were the best of friends and then became the best of enemies. 100-year love-hate relationship between Britain and Germany. My own father, who was about as Rhodesian English you come, he says, I can't believe we wasted our time fighting for the French twice. To my father, the real enemy were the French, and we should have kept fighting the French. And why did we ever make the Germans enemies? Should have been Britain and Germany together against France. Now, Ian Smith had a better insight on it, and he said to me in his latter days that it's a pity we didn't fight along with Germany on the Eastern Front against a real enemy, which was the Bolshevik Soviet Union. That would have spared a lot of people a lot of grief. So, interesting book. Our own good friend, Stephen Mitford Goodson, wrote A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, in which he points out that all wars of the 20th century have been bankers' wars, and that these wars are not fought about geopolitics and ideology as we think, but it's at its root economics. And Stephen Mitford Goodson pointed out that, amazingly, the Western enemies in the 20th century have all had one coincidental thing in common. And it's not one of the targets of the Allies has been a country that's got a Rothschild bank. Every single country, from national Germany to fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, didn't have a Rothschild bank. Assad's Syria, of course, Putin's Russia, you can talk about Iran, Iraq, Libya. None of them had a Rothschild-controlled bank. Now, what a coincidence. Not saying that's the cause of the war, but isn't that amazing that somehow or another banking had something to do with, even if coincidentally, every one of these targets. And you can, that, by the way, he goes all the way back to Napoleon. Napoleon's France also didn't have a Rothschild-controlled bank. Patrick Buchanan's written probably one of the best books on the First and Second World War, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World. Phenomenal book. I've been through this several times. It's such an insightful analysis. And by the way, you might be interested to know that friends of President Trump, who I met when I was in Washington, D.C., said that Patrick Buchanan is one of the favorite authors of Donald Trump. And he said, if you want to understand Donald Trump's foreign policy, read Pat Buchanan. And I immediately recognized that it's true. Pat Buchanan's been talking for years that America should acquire Greenland, that Canada should be brought under America, we must get back the Panama Canal. A lot of Pat Buchanan's ideology is seen in Donald Trump's policies, and also the fact that he doesn't have any illusions about NATO and all that sort of thing, and he's not that impressed with the EU. So, interesting. Patrick Buchanan, I think, is one of the finest politicians America's produced in the 20th century. He's the historian, the speechwriter, the strategist for Ronald Reagan. And Pat Buchanan became a presidential candidate in his own right. I'm glad to see that Donald Trump's reading Pat Buchanan, because he's a serious intellectual for the conservative movement in America. Well, we've also got other books we recommend to help people reclaim the campus for Christ, Understanding the Times, The Battle for Truth. When we understand the worldviews out there, it helps us to make much more sense of what's going on in these university campuses. We've got to know our history and other history in order to be able to make wise policy decisions, which, of course, it would have really helped if the security people in Sarajevo had known their history. Then they might have avoided the First World War. At Reformation Society, we've lectured over the years on the causes, consequences, and catastrophe of World War I. And you can get these on our sermon audio, Understanding the First World War, The Best of Enemies, Evaluating Hollywood Films on World War I, Propaganda. The first casualty of war is truth. To discern between propaganda and real history, these are always things that we tackle. So if the soldiers at that time could have known what would become of their countries, they wouldn't have fought against each other, they would have fought side by side. And that's a perspective I've heard many a time from my own father, who fought all 6 years of the Second World War in the 8th Army. And I've heard at many a moth meeting, Memorial Order of Tin Hat, many veterans of these wars said, next time we fight, it's side by side. We're not going to fight against fellow Christians, we're going to fight together. Our real enemy is Marxism. Destroy the enemy. And you'll get these on our frontlinemissionsa.org website.